And that's where we kind of left off last week. And let me just remind us here this morning that God uses who He wants to, when He wants to. God uses what He wills to accomplish His good and right desires. I'm often reminded of something that Pastor Gore has said in the past to us, and that is that God will use us either as a good example or a bad example, but He will use us. And let us think about this, that our collective desire as a church should be a desire for God to use us for good right here where He has us. That should be our collective desire as a church, for God to use us, for God to work through us, for God to do good through us, His people. And our prayer should be for God's will to be done here on earth just as it's done in heaven. There's a line in a song that I like to listen to and sing along to, and it says, "O Father, use my ransomed life in any way you choose, and let my song forever be, my only boast is you." The thought that God would use the Babylonians, though, in this way can certainly be a perplexing thought, but I want us to be certain here and make clear here that God was in no wise endorsing the wickedness of the Babylonians, but He was still going to use them to accomplish His will and His good purposes. It reminded me of a question that Abraham asked to God back when Abraham was kind of in conversation with God, asking Him to save Sodom and Gomorrah. And he said, if you find this many righteous people there, will you save it? And Abraham asked this question to God in that conversation. He said, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" And the answer to that is yes, He will always do what's right. And I pray that as we continue to study this book of Habakkuk, that our faith in that truth will be strengthened, that God will always do what is right. Today we're picking back up where we left off last week, considering God's reply to Habakkuk. And so today what we're going to do, we're going to finish out through verse number 11, and then Lord willing, next week when we gather, we'll look starting in verse number 12. Verse 12 starts Habakkuk's second reply, or his first reply to God, but his second concern, we'll see that beginning in verse number 12. But for today, we're going to finish out through verse number 11, and there's some truths here that I want us to bring out together as a church as we look at the rest of God's reply. And so if you're taking notes today, you can write this down for a title for this message. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to borrow a phrase from verse number 12. Let's go ahead and read verse 12. This is the beginning of Habakkuk's reply that, Lord willing, we'll look at next week. He says this, "Art thou not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, mine Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, thou hast ordained them for judgment. And, Almighty God, thou hast established them for correction." So if you're taking notes today, the title of this is Ordained for Judgment. Ordained for Judgment. Let's go ahead and read this passage that we'll be looking at today. We're going to start in verse 5. To remember this context, we'll read down through verse number 11. You can follow along. It says here, Habakkuk 1, verse 5, "Behold ye among the heathen, and regard and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days, which ye will not believe, though it be told you. For lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs." And here's the text for today. "They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity shall proceed of themselves. Their horses also are swifter than the leopards, and are more fierce than the evening wolves. And their horsemen shall spread themselves, and their horsemen shall come from afar. They shall fly as the eagle that hasteth to eat. They shall come all for violence. Their faces shall sup as the east wind, and they shall gather the captivity as the sand. And they shall scoff at the kings and the princes, and shall scorn unto them. They shall deride every stronghold. They shall heap dust and take it. Verse 11, then shall his mind change, and he shall pass over and offend, imputing this his power unto his God. Interesting passage to look at here today, but Lord willing, we can draw out some truths that we can apply to our heart and life today. I want you to first off to note that this is God's description of the Babylonian armies. All right, that's the first thing I want us to note here. This is in God's reply to Habakkuk. And so God here is describing these Babylonian armies. And so God is the one giving these descriptions here, and he's inviting Habakkuk, as well as us, as well as really the nation of Judah, to picture kind of in our mind's eye the armies of Babylon coming to take them captive. He's getting Habakkuk to picture this happening, and he's showing him vividly what the armies look like. It says here first in verse number 6. Let's go ahead and reread that. It says, for lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. As we consider God's description of these armies, we see first in verse number 6 that they were ruthless. That they were ruthless. Verse 6 describes them as bitter and hasty. All right? This gives us the overarching picture of the Babylonian military machine. They were bitter. They were hasty. This is their description. They had a reputation for swift ruthlessness. And God here is describing the speed and the severity at which the Babylonian army would move and conquer through a land and through a people. And they were hostile toward other nations. At this time, they were currently at war with the Assyrians, which would eventually lead to the demise of the Assyrian Empire and the rise of the Babylonian Empire. But we see here in verse 6 that God describes them as ruthless. In verse number 7, we see that God describes them as being arrogant. Verse number 7, they are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity shall proceed of themselves. They were their own law. They were the judge, jury, and the executioner. They answered to no one. They considered themselves to be the highest power. They were powerful, and they knew it. That's why verse 7 describes them as terrible and dreadful, because that was the reputation that they had created. They didn't care about your territory. They didn't care about your gods. They were so full of themselves. Verse 8 goes on. God describes them and how rapidly they would move. Hang with me here as we look at this. Verse number 8, their horses also are swifter than the leopards and are more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen shall spread themselves, and their horsemen shall come from afar. They shall fly as the eagle that hasteth to eat. They moved rapidly. All of this vivid imagery in verse number 8 is kind of giving us this understanding that they were quick in their advancements. They were probably very efficient. Even swifter than leopards, even more fierce than the evening wolves who are on the prowl. They could cover large areas in a short amount of time. Verse number 9 goes on, and God describes them that they were all together violent. Look at verse 9. There shall come all for violence. Their faces shall sup up as the east wind, and they shall gather the captivity as the sand. The whole army was coming for violence. That was their battle cry. That was their desire. The comment here about the east wind in